the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
I'm happy to be here. I was also a guest lecturer, I guess, a couple of years ago, and had a really good time that evening, and hope that this evening is the same. I look forward to your questions, comments, and hopefully an engaging conversation as the evening proceeds. As Khalid mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the nexus, kind of the connection between sustainability, energy transition, climate action, and finance. And this is something that has really kind of taken shape in a big way over the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, globally, and even in the United States. We were a little behind. Europe was a little bit ahead for a while, but now this has become kind of a mainstream idea that all of these elements are really interconnected and have to be looked at together if you're going to optimize them. It's not that you can't look at them separately, and many people do, but if you're really looking to optimize and really looking to make the biggest impact in a positive way, looking at them together strategically is the best way to do that. So that's the topic. On this slide here, you see a picture of me at COP27, which was a year ago. Not sure how many of you are familiar with the COP, which is United Nations every year, except for during COVID. They put on what's called COP, the Conference of the Parties, where all the nations of the world send negotiators to talk about how they can lower their carbon footprint and be more sustainable. And especially since Paris COP, this has really taken on a much more obvious, much more broad, much more impactful kind of status in the world. And every year, COP, again, with the exception of during COVID, COP has increased the number of people and the types of people and organizations that are attending. And this year it'll be in Dubai. It starts later this week. I'll be participating, although I won't be there in person this year. And it'll be in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. And of course, with the Middle East being kind of the cradle of the oil and gas industry, it's a very interesting dynamic at COP this year. Last year was in Egypt. The year before that, it was in Glasgow. The year before that, it was in Madrid. And those are all the COPs that I participated in. And it's a place where all types of people, all disciplines, all sectors of the markets, and all types of people, just in general, and young and old, are there, all engaging on the topic of climate, but more broadly, really sustainability, and over the last few years, resilience. And attending the COPs over the last several years has really shaped my perspectives, but it's also heightened my passions and interest in this topic. and really being a cop over the last few years, as I was finishing my time at WSP and leading the climate resilience and sustainability team there, um, we decided as kind of one of my last things I would work on at WSP would be to write this book called, Future Ready: Your Organization's Guide to Rethinking Climate Resilience and Sustainability. So a lot of what we'll talk about, but not everything we'll talk about tonight, is touched upon in this book. Happy to share the link if people are interested in the book, but we'll be talking about it, and I'm very, very happy to take questions at the end as well. All right, so the next, hold on a second. All right, so before we talk in detail about the book and all the examples, practical examples that are represented in the book, I want to talk more holistically about the topic for tonight's seminar, in this nexus between sustainability, energy transition, climate action, and finance. And there's another book, one of my favorite books that maybe some of you have read or at least aware of. It was by John Doerr a couple of years ago. And John Doerr came out of the private equity and investor, Silicon Valley kind of circles, made his early money on some of the technology startups in the late 90s. And ever since then has been a major investor, an impact investor. And over the last several years has really spurred on by his children, asking him hard questions about the climate and what's going on and what kind of world are we leaving future generations. He really started focusing in on what will it take to bring climate change under control, to have any chance of meeting the goals that have been set forth by the United Nations and at the Paris Climate Conference several years ago. And so he talked about the different elements that will go into basically a set of solutions that will work together to solve the overall climate action challenge. And so in his book, he actually talks about the different elements, and there's a poster that folds out of the book, and this is an image on the left of that poster. It talks about the different elements of his solution. And he goes into great detail and is very practical. So again, it's a book that I would definitely recommend reading. It's very much on topic for this seminar and this program at Stevens. And it's one of the most implementable ways to basically roadmap the solution in the future for our planet that would involve getting climate change under control. And on the right-hand side are the different sectors of infrastructure. These are all sectors I've worked in across my 30-plus year career as an engineer, and also applying my environmental law background together with the engineering background that I have in the consulting industry, working with all types of clients, federal governments, state governments, local governments, working with the commercial sector, but working with all types of infrastructure. And if you start at the bottom, with buildings, and the key element there being how do you transition buildings to be more green, more clean, have lower carbon, and implementing electrification while you're doing that. And then likewise with transportation, transitioning to clean and low carbon vehicles, clean and low carbon infrastructure construction methods, and operations and maintenance methods. And again, electrification being a key element of that. And then water resources. How do you handle issues of sea level rise, of flood management, and also scarcity of water resources? And then just environment more broadly in the mining, industry and agricultural industry, the other elements, how can you run these industries in a way that is more protective, is more green, by implementing better practices? And then lastly, at the upper left, the electrification, the energy transition, if you will, uh, through the electrification of energy itself, more renewables, carbon capture, uses in storage technologies, battery storage, hydrogen fuel cells, and other elements. Um, and all of this is directly related to sustainability, resilience, climate action, and more recently, finance coming to the table, because governments, no matter how big, no matter how good the economy is going, um, there's just no way they can pay for all of what will be necessary to implement um, greener, more sustainable, more resilient infrastructure in cities, and places to live on their own. So the private sector has to participate as well. And that includes private finance to go with public sector finance and the multinational banks that especially are active in the developing world, the global south, um, whereas more in the global north, the more highly developed, wealthier nations, uh, the governments plus private sector can do it on their own. But in the more developing nations of the world, you really need the multilateral banks to give it a kickstart. And that's where the last key piece of the puzzle started coming to the table and coming to the cops. Really, in the last 4 or 5 cops, they've been more and more present, more and more active, and more stepping up to the plate and making commitments of their own. And that's really made a big difference for climate action. But by no means are we there yet, and there's much more needed. But at least we've got the right people engaging, and even the oil and gas industry now engaging, and a lot of people who believe in sustainability and the environment want to demonize the oil and gas industry, and there's good reason for them to want to do that. And I'm no big fan of many of the things that the oil and gas industry has done, and the impacts it's had. Don't get me wrong, but for this to work, for climate action to work, the oil and gas industry is not going away as much as many people would like it to. And eventually it will, but it can't go away in the near future. And even if you could get rid of fossil fuel for heating and for vehicles and everything else, you can't get rid of it for things like pharmaceuticals, medicines, that other products, that there's no other way to produce them and make them other than through the use of fossil fuel and products, petrochemical products. So you need them at the table too, so that at least if they're going to exist, let them exist in a more sustainable, more green way, and be better stewards of the planet and the environment. And and so that's all really starting to happen now. And it'll be interesting to see how COP28 in Dubai unfolds over the next few weeks. And I'll certainly be participating in several sessions and watching and seeing what comes out at the end in terms of real action items and commitments, hopefully. Um, and when you look at all of these elements needing to work together, um, there are both risks, obviously climate risks and the risk of flooding and sea level rise and heat impacts to communities, real health risks. But there are also lots of opportunities. There's lots of money to be made. There's lots of careers to be had, um, as really all industries look to meet the moment on climate action. And I'm guessing that many of you who are in this seminar and are studying this topic of sustainability feel likewise. And I'm here to tell you firsthand that there are many opportunities. And yes, you can do good for the planet, do good for the environment, but you can also have a very good career and be part of very robust, thriving, growing businesses. And so yes, you have to look at both the risks and the opportunities, embrace it all to meet the moment. And that's basically what John Doerr talks about in his book, how you can do that. Not any one person, not any one industry, but together and do that. Um, and again, just like I talked about in the graphic on the right, he breaks it into, electrifying transportation and vehicles, um, decarbonizing the grid itself. Of course, is renewables, but it's also distributed generation, getting away from the idea that you have large power plants and then these long transmission lines that are costly, take a long time to build and to permit. Um, get the power, smaller scale, more green through the use of renewables, but also battery storage and other storage technologies that can be applied locally, and even small scale nuclear, um, will be viable in the next few decades, as well as hydrogen. We also have to look at our food supplies. And we really need to look at all aspects of the type of food we eat, how it gets produced, whether there are other alternatives and substitutes, such as non-meat meats, is just one great example, but it's not the only example. Just have more organic techniques in agriculture. And as we're doing all this, we have to protect nature. We have to preserve our natural resources, and not just from a climate change standpoint, but just from a use and enjoyment of life standpoint. It's an important part of why our planet is such a precious place to live and how we need to keep it that way. And just like we need to fix food, we need to clean up industry again. Better materials, greener materials. Uh, New ones are being created all the time. Same thing with technologies and the way we maintain and operate those technologies, removing carbon from the materials themselves, but also from the way we run our industries, the way we run our buildings, our homes, our transportation systems, et cetera. Um, he also talks about the importance of politics and policy. You can't get away from it. You can't depoliticize this issue as much as we all might like to, um, because government does have to play such an important role, and governments can't do everything. They have priorities. Um, you need to advocate. You need to take an active role in developing greener policies, more progressive policies from a climate protection standpoint and a more resilience standpoint if you want to have a more sustainable economy. Um, and then you have to take all these policies and politics and you have to bring them to action. It's one thing to pass laws, it's one thing to create charters and new nonprofits and organizations and talk about what needs to be done, and that's important. But then you have to actually do things, and getting people to understand it's not just about talking, not just about setting policies, but it's also about everybody doing their part. As little as that may be in some cases, every little bit counts. So everybody needs to take part in this. Um, and then one of the key elements of this and why I chose this topic tonight is his last 2 points about innovation and investment, and they go hand in hand. Uh, what John Doerr says in his book, and I totally agree with him, is as much as we might want to invest in climate change, improvements and decarbonization and everything else, with the technologies we have today and the amount of money that even if we reprioritize everything that governments have to spend and even private sectors have to spend, we will not meet the goals, the climate action goals, and certainly the goals of the Paris Accords to keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. Um, but there is a way. That's the good news of his book. There is a way that it can be done. And the way is that, yes, have governments do what they can, have nonprofits and global organizations do what they can. But on top of that, have the private sector with the government's help in some cases, bring technologies to market and to scalable use faster than we ever have. And the way that can happen is by the private sector as well as the government's investing and bringing money to the table and picking the right technology, the ones that will have the most impact, the ones that can realistically come to maturity within a time frame that will have its most impact. And that's not a set list, because as soon as we might set a list for what are the most promising technologies today that we know of that are under development, a year from now, some new technology, some new inventor will come up with something that may jump up the list and replace other ones on the list, maybe even make them obsolete. And so this is a dynamic relationship between the private sector, the innovators, the inventors, the investors and government, all working together on this innovate, invest, monitor progress, pick the ones that are having the biggest impact, invest in those, scale those up, while you're still looking at the new ones coming available all of the time, so that you're constantly taking the best and the brightest of the technologies and putting your money where it will have its most impact. And you will make mistakes. Not every innovation will end up having the same positive results. So you also have to know when to stop investing, stop developing a certain technology if something better comes along, or that technology just proves to, for whatever reason, not be working the way people thought it would at the beginning. And so it's really, think about all the different organizations, all the different disciplines, all the different people that have to be involved for this to work, because it all feeds on itself. It's all interrelated. And so it takes communication, it takes working across sectors, working across organizations, it takes partnering, which is something I've spent a lot of my time, and especially in the last part of my career, doing, is working with nonprofit organizations who help bring both individuals together, but also private sector companies and governments and nonprofits together. And that's what it's going to take. And there are many ways for individuals like you all to play a role and to take the skills you're learning in courses like this and in programs like what Stevens has, and being a part of this and turning movements into action, as John Doerr talks about. So lastly, I talked about the book and maybe giving some specific examples. And this is kind of the table of contents of the book. And I'll just kind of hit the treetops of a few of the elements here by way of bringing you examples. And then by all means, you can ask me questions at the end and we can go into more detail and talk about other examples. There's just no way in the amount of time we have here this evening to hit them all. So I'll just hit a few of the more representative examples and ideas that are fleshed out, in the book. And really, the book represents a lot of what I've done over the last many years, but more broadly, what the team at WSP, where I was the last 4 years, in the climate resilience and sustainability business unit and the other parts of the company, what they worked on together in the US, but also globally. The forward of the book was actually written by Anthony Kane and Dr. Spiro from Harvard University. And they were one of the earliest leaders that brought the Envision rating system into being. ISI, the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, is the kind of the promoter, the owner of Envision. If you're familiar with LEED for buildings, well, Envision is for all infrastructure. And Envision also brings in resilience, not just sustainability. And it has a practical kind of scoring system that you can use to, yes, get a rating. You can get Envision Gold, Envision Platinum, et cetera, much like LEED. But you can also just use it to train your people. You can use it to plan your projects. And at the center of Envision is this concept of not just building things right, meaning building things that are green, building them in a green way, operating them in a green way, but also building the right things, meaning you can build a building and it could be the most green building, it could be LEED Platinum. But if it's not in the best location or it wasn't even needed to begin with, if there were other ways to take care of the need that building supposedly is taken care of, or other places that it could have been built with less impact, then it wasn't the right project. It might have been built right, but it wasn't the right thing to build in the right place. And so that's one of the more powerful things that the Envision rating system teaches you and gives you a mechanism for applying it when you think about projects and plan projects and implement them. So that's touched upon by Anthony and Spiro in the forward. The introduction is about my turning point personally with Superstorm Sandy, which I lived through. Based here in the New York metro area, live in New Jersey, spend part of my time in Florida now, which is also a climate action hotbed with sea level rise concerns and everything else. But really, Superstorm Sandy was a turning point for me, but for many people, because it hit the financial capital, could save the world, but certainly the financial capital of the United States in New York City. And so people woke up about the economic impacts of climate change and extreme weather, which of course are related to each other. And so when you think about how you make a difference, you can think about Superstorm Sandy, what people learned there, and what you see being built in New York City and in a place like Hoboken, where Stevens is located now, with the Rebuild by Design program that was spawned by Hurricane Sandy and the storm surge barriers that are being built in Hoboken and the sustainable parks and schools and things like that that are also being built. Really, a lot of that was spawned and even funded as an outgrowth of Superstorm Sandy. So there's a lot of examples coming out of that storm and that experience in New York City and in New Jersey for sure, but even more broadly. And they've now become examples for others across the nation and even globally to emulate. So that's why I chose that for the topic of the introduction for the book. Getting into kind of the key elements, really, if you think about infrastructure in its biggest buckets, buildings and streets, the urban environment, the fact that, yes, it's carbon reduction, being more green, but thinking in terms of two types of carbon, both the embodied carbon in the things you're building, the buildings themselves, the steel, the concrete, but also the operational carbon, which many times is actually more impactful or more wasteful than the embodied carbon and how green the building itself is in terms of its construction. And so thinking about both carbons is something that more and more is mainstream when you think about how to design buildings with more efficient cooling systems, things like heat pumps, which run on electricity, is cleaner than running off of heating oil or even natural gas furnaces or steam plants, like New York City and other places like it have done for many years. Also, the different ways you can measure how green something is, how sustainable something is. I mentioned LEED already. There's also internationally, there's the BREEAM system. And all systems have rating systems, certification systems have their pros and cons. And so I'm not here to promote one or the other. I would just say you should be familiar with all the different systems, Envision, LEED, BREEAM, on down the list, because they each have something different about them, and might be something you can leverage or at a minimum just learn from. Um, the idea of putting people first when you're thinking about sustainability, both in terms of buildings and how people will live and work within the building, but also communities more broadly. Um, and the need to have everyone who's going to be a stakeholder in the buildings or the infrastructure, the cities, the neighborhoods, to have a say in the process. And you actually score points in these rating systems, typically, certainly in Envision, based on how much input you've taken, how actively you engage the people in your projects. Um, things like more green cement, more green steel. These are probably the biggest impacts when it comes to buildings and embodied carbon. And there are many substitute systems and technologies that are being developed and scaled right now. And there are example projects everywhere, but certainly in the book that talk about how you can apply these more advanced materials in a useful way. Data centers with all the AI and all the big data, everybody having electronics and more powerful processors means more and more data can be stored and leveraged. Um, Data centers are huge energy and water consumers, and very inefficient in their earliest kind of designs. How do you make them more green? It's something. There's a whole team at WSP that does nothing but that, looking at data centers and that impact. Um, those are just a few examples, kind of on the buildings and streets and communities part of the equation, the climate action equation. Then transportation, which is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas, of course. Um, the idea of electrifying not just cars, but all modes of transportation, including maybe someday airplanes and ships, large scale ships. We've already got electric boat technology at the smaller scale, um, starting to see electric trucks, freight trucks, electric freight trains, um, all the things that it takes to electrify transportation and the changes that it will allow, including self-driving vehicles, um, less need for having your own vehicles, uh, less need for big parking structures because vehicles are on the move constantly. They don't need to be parked anywhere. Everybody doesn't have to have their own. These are all things that are being developed now and will be coming over the next several decades. Again, stakeholders and community-based transportation and resilience built into transportation, protect from storm surge, from inland flooding, from sea level rise, as you're building transportation. And in Manhattan, the one of the largest projects in the country right now is the Big U, which will protect the tip of Manhattan from a Sandy type surge, but also will build into it the transportation systems and the waterfront recreation and resilience and nature-based solutions all at the same time. Um, Dealing with urban heating, which streets and roofs as well, especially when they're darker in color, are a big generator of urban heat island effect. How can you use different materials to also address the problem of extreme heat in cities as the globe continues to warm? It becomes a bigger and bigger problem with higher population densities. Um, the idea of hydrogen as a future fuel as well, and fuel cells, especially if it's green hydrogen and not coming from natural gas. Um, Building hydrogen hubs in the U.S. so that it's available as technology scales and more vehicles are able to use hydrogen fuel. And hydrogen, I think, won't be necessarily as big for small scale vehicles like cars, but will be a game changer when it comes to airplanes, large ships in the maritime industry. Um, vehicles and equipment that need a high power density. Um, Hydrogen actually is much more suited than batteries. So that's a big part of what's happening out there in business and in the infrastructure industry right now. Um, and then the water and energy resources, the energy transition, but also water becoming more and more scarce, flooding becoming more and more prevalent, um, sometimes in the same exact location. It's not an oxymoron that you have places where their aquifers are being depleted, their water supplies are going down, and yet, due to extreme precipitation, inland flooding is a huge issue in the very same locations, and it's getting worse. And what are the different technologies, and how can you use nature actually to address both? The idea of sponge cities and more soaking in the water rather than letting the water run off, reusing that water as you let it soak in. Um, of course, energy from the sun and the wind, but the sun and the wind aren't always shining and blowing. So how do you store the excess when there is excess so that you can use it when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing? And that part of the economy is one of the hottest areas right now. The idea of energy storage, microgrids, distributed generation, and how it all can work together with the existing power grids we have, which needs control technologies, more efficient transmission and distribution, um, higher powered monitoring systems, all things that are being worked on and are talked about in the book as well. And then when you get towards the end of the book and the epilogue, there's an epilogue about climate finance in particular. And it's written by Stacy Swan, who's a global expert in climate finance, and talking about how all the different players in the investment and finance world are starting to work together, but also how they can work together even more effectively in the future. Um, and then the afterword that I wrote, entitled "Why There's No I in Team or CRS," CRS, of course, being climate resilience and sustainability, how it takes a multidisciplinary team and how you have to think organizationally, not just from a technology standpoint, not just from an operations and maintenance standpoint, but how do you change your organization, how you work as a business or as a government agency to be more resilient, be more sustainable, and be better stewards of the climate. Um, and with the overarching kind of conclusion that I already kind of hit on with the envision idea of, building the right future in the right way. So first deciding what is the future we want. And then once we decide what is the future we want, then applying the right technology, the right techniques to do it in the best, most green, most resilient way possible. And so that's the idea. That's the whole essence of the book, but it's also really the theme I wanted to talk to you all here about tonight. And then lastly, Khalid mentioned, where I'm from now, I started my own independent consultancy um, in January after I left WSP, and it's called LE4. The L, it comes from my last name, Lewis, but the four E's being environment, economics, education, and equity. Um, and I think all of those elements are critically important for sustainability. Economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and social sustainability. And that's why I named my new consulting firm LE4. And it's something that I've enjoyed a lot. I'm working with insurance companies and agencies. I'm working with renewable technology companies. I'm working with software companies, working with infrastructure firms of all sizes, minority-owned, women-owned business being a particular focus of mine. And it's been an incredibly rewarding last 10 or 11 months. I'm continually learning from my clients, from my interactions at events and industry organizations where I'm on the boards of, as well as being speaker at different events. And you never stop learning. If you take nothing else from me here this evening, um, never stop learning, because even if you could know everything today, tomorrow something new is going to come, and it's coming faster and faster with more and more impact. So you're never there. You've never learned it all, especially in this field of sustainability. Um, and it's something that I've really enjoyed and will continue to enjoy. Even after I retire, I'll continue to be involved in this field in a volunteer, posture, because I enjoy it so much and because it's so impactful, and I just love to learn. And I love to meet new people and learn from them as well. And so with that, I hope to learn from you with some of your questions, any comments you have, any experiences people have. Um, and with that, I'll open it up.